Clare Daley. I'm a nutritional therapist based at Cytoplan. I wasn't always a nutritional therapist. I first of all did a degree in biology, and then I worked for the Environment Agency for a number of years. And then in my early 40s, I retrained as a nutritional therapist. And I did work in private practice for a few years, 5 years. And now I've been with the team at Cytoplan for the past 4 years, and I deliver practitioner education. So that's my role. So Cytoplan, I think probably you've all heard of us. This is the view from our offices, beautiful view over the Malvern Hills. They're actually a bit bigger, they look like tiny pimples there. I mean, they're not mountains by any means, but they're about 18 kilometres long and make a nice walk. And I see when I'm sitting in the room that this view is taken from, the meeting room, doing one-to-one trainings, sometimes I see people jumping off the hills. They do have parapets attached. Oh, that's cool. But it's quite nice actually. It's a lovely thing to be able to look at that while I'm talking to people on Zoom.
Have you not tried it?
So parapenting, no, I can't say I have actually. No, I don't quite fancy that. We do food-based products basically. We're wholly owned by a charitable foundation, the AIM Foundation, whose goal is to support health improvement projects. We don't manufacture anything ourselves. Our nutrients are sourced globally, and we use a number of contract manufacturers depending on the particular product. But everybody is GMP certified. So today then, I'm going to be talking about expanding on some of the things that Rosemary's talked about this morning, and talking about brain health, focusing on Alzheimer's in particular, and Professor Bredson's work. Rosemary mentioned him briefly. So I'm just going to explain the basic pathology of Alzheimer's, give you an overview, outline the key components of Professor Bredson's diet and lifestyle approach to cognitive decline. And this all came about in 2014. He published a paper with 10 patients, 9 of which had significant improvements. Well, he described it as a reversal of their symptoms and reversal of their disease process. Obviously, we as practitioners have to be quite cautious about using that word reversal, but he described 90% people actually reversed cognitive decline. And also I'll just touch on briefly how his approach is relevant for other brain disorders, so things like anxiety and depression. And I will talk a bit more about gluten as well as part of this, because that's part of the issue. So in terms of magnitude, about 1 in 4 of us will experience a mental health problem in any given year. I'm sure you've all heard that statistic. Around 1 in 3 GP appointments involves a mental health component. 57 million prescriptions for antidepressants were written in 2014, an increase of 46% in 2 years. That is terrifying. And depression and anxiety themselves increase the risk of cognitive decline. Why do you think that is? Any thoughts on that?
Not getting any social contact.
Yes, yeah. And part of it, in terms of the biological mechanisms, it's inflammation. Depression, has an inflammatory component, and of course that increases risk of cognitive decline as well. Now, as well as this, many more people suffer brain fog, mood swings, concentration issues, feel apathetic and unmotivated. When I was working in private practice, somebody might come to see me for weight loss or IBS or hormone issues, but many of them, even if it wasn't the reason for coming to see me, would complain that they had some level of brain fog. Alzheimer's itself is the most frequent cause of age-related cognitive decline. I mean, there's a number of different types of dementia. Alzheimer's is one of those, and it's the most frequent cause. 30 million people are affected globally, and it's likely to be 160 by 2050. So if you, by the way, these slides, Clive will send you a PDF of them so you can, yeah. So if you think, increasing by 5 times, if you think, or more than 5 times, if you think of how many people now with some level of cognitive decline, just imagine what it's going to look like then. It's the 3rd leading cause of death in the USA, and dementia is now the leading cause of death in the UK. It became the leading cause in 2016. And 65% of those affected are women. It's not known exactly why, but it's thought it might be related to sort of more hormone changes through, or more drastic hormone changes through a woman's life. And what's really worrying as well is that it's happening at a younger and younger age. So we've always thought of dementia as a problem of old age, and it really isn't anymore. So there was some research done in Mexico City finding the pathology associated with Alzheimer's in the brain of teenagers. So any ideas why that might be?
Or diet.
Yes, obviously there's a high rate of diabetes there, isn't there? Yes, but anything else? Yes, it's actually been related to the air pollution, very high levels of particulates in the air in Mexico City. And there was one study that was, so these teenagers haven't got Alzheimer's, they've just got some of the changes, some of the early changes that are seen. And there is a study there actually that is giving them dark chocolate, 20 grams of dark chocolate a day as a protective measure to help protect their brains, because of course it's high in antioxidants.
Can you say that again?
Sure, no, dark chocolate, 70% dark chocolate.
70%.
Yeah, so it's 20 grams a day of 70% dark chocolate. So the features of Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain that causes problems with memory, thinking and behaviour. It's not a normal part of ageing. In particular, there's a difficulty in remembering new information. So people can remember something that happened 20 or 30 years ago, but they can't remember what they had for breakfast. You all remember what you had for breakfast? There's also, and so even when they're prompted, so you know, something might happen, let's say in the morning, and they forget it. Well, we might all forget things, but usually when you're prompted, you then say, oh yeah, I remember now. And that doesn't happen in Alzheimer's, it's just a blank. Difficulty completing everyday tasks, so they might forget how to do things that they used to be able to do, so maybe they can't use the remote control anymore. I mean, some things have got so complicated, you know, a year ago we had so many different remotes, I couldn't use them either, but I'd never been able to use them, so that's the difference, really. Trouble with words, numbers and navigation, and also behavioural change, which can be quite upsetting for the family. You know, people can become very anxious or aggressive as well. And it's been divided into a number of different stages. So stage 1 is normal. I'm not quite sure why that counts as a stage, but anyway. Stage 2 is normal age forgetfulness. And that's really, it's just normal because it's so common. It's also sometimes called subjective cognitive impairment. So that's where a person becomes aware that they are maybe becoming more forgetful or having other changes. But other people probably aren't noticing it, and they might be able to compensate for it. And then we've got mild cognitive impairment. Now, by this stage, other people might be noticing that something's wrong, and it's usually diagnosable. Now, not everybody progresses from that stage into Alzheimer's. Some people might just stay at the mild cognitive impairment stage. But then obviously with stage 4, that's mild Alzheimer's, again, diagnosable. Stage 5, moderate. And by sort of stage 6 or 7, somebody's likely to be in a nursing home and need round-the-clock 24-hour care. So a bit about the pathology, so what you would see in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's. So there's an abundance of things called plaques and tangles. So plaques are deposits of a protein called beta-amyloid. Tangles are twisted fibres of another protein called tau, and I'm going to go into these in a bit more detail. Now, it is normal to develop some plaques and tangles with age, and there are mechanisms in the brain for clearing these as they develop, but those with Alzheimer's develop far more, and the reason is there are things in the brain that trigger the creation of these at a greater rate, and also their brain isn't as effective at breaking them down and cleaning them up. So plaques and tangles block cell communication and disrupt processes within the cell that the cells need to survive, and so you get cell death eventually. So on the left-hand side you can see a sort of normal brain, so the neurons, they're not actually purple, but and then on the right-hand side you've got Alzheimer's, so you can see the brown clumps in between the cells, and then inside the cells, not quite so visible, but the tangles, the tau tangles, so those are inside the cells. And just a bit of revision on the types of brain cells. So obviously we know neurons are the cells that communicate in the brain, but they're not the only cell in the brain. There are a number of support cells. So you've got astrocytes that provide nutrients to the neurons, oligodendrocytes which create the myelin, and also microglia, and microglia are quite important in Alzheimer's, and they're the immune cells in the brain, and actually they form a significant part of the brain, and in Alzheimer's they become overactive and pro-inflammatory. And then we've also got the glymphatic system in the brain. So the glymphatic system, fairly recently discovered, is sort of the brain's clearing system, and it's particularly active at night when we sleep. And so if people aren't getting enough sleep, they might not be doing, clearance terribly effectively. So in terms of the hypotheses related to Alzheimer's, one of the early hypotheses was the amyloid hypothesis, and this is that Alzheimer's is due to a build-up of amyloid. So beta amyloid is formed when a protein called amyloid precursor protein is cut into small sections by two enzymes. And as I said before, you get a lot being produced and it's not cleared effectively. So that was one hypothesis. And then the tau hypothesis is that hyperphosphorylated tau protein and neurofibrillary tangles is what causes Alzheimer's. But as I will go through, there are now lots of other hypotheses for Alzheimer's, and it's not about a single hypothesis. There's elements of all these different things.
Surely Alzheimer's is multifactorial.
Exactly, that's the point, yeah, which I'll get to. So if we just look at a few of these different sort of pathologies, so the amyloid precursor protein, it is a normal protein that occurs in the brain. And it's a transmembrane protein, and it can either go down, be processed down a trophic pathway, and if it goes down that pathway, it generates peptides that support synaptic maintenance. So that is a beneficial pathway. Or it can go down what's called the antitrophic pathway, and in that case, beta amyloid of various lengths is produced. So just understanding that, what might we think we want to do to prevent Alzheimer's? Yes, it's obvious, isn't it, really? What we want to do is think, okay, well, what things cause it to go down the trophic pathway, and what causes it to go down the antitrophic pathway, and try and shift the balance. So Professor Bredston describes APP as a molecular switch. It switches from sort of trophic to antitrophic. And it also does this, what happens is there's a positive feedback loop that occurs. So if it goes down one particular pathway, you will get more of that pathway by a process of positive feedback. So if you're producing a lot of beta amyloid, that will increase the production of beta amyloid. So not a good thing. And the three things that really impact beta amyloid production are inflammation, lack of trophic support, and toxicity. Those all cause increased beta amyloid production. So obviously what we want to do is identify what's causing the inflammation, make sure that there's proper trophic support, identify any toxicity, and remove those things. What do you think will happen? Because actually, in fact, beta amyloid is a protective mechanism. It's produced by the brain when there are these things as a protective mechanism. Now, some of the drug therapy has focused on removing or reducing beta amyloid in the brain. So what do you think that's doing? It's then leaving the brain more susceptible to damage. So what has happened is sometimes people see an improvement initially, and then the deterioration continues. Now, tau protein, on the other hand, again, this is a normal protein that occurs in the brain. It's involved in microtubules. So microtubules form part of the transport system within cells, and so tau is quite abundant in those, but it can become hyperphosphorylated. So too many phosphate groups attached to it, it then becomes insoluble and forms these tangles. And there are a number of things that can cause that to happen. So, for example, increased cellular calcium. Calcium, obviously we all think of calcium in terms of bones, etc., but calcium also plays a number of important roles within the cell. It triggers cell signaling, causes things to happen, and levels are kept at a very low level, but it can build up, and that can then trigger the increase in hyperphosphorylation of tau. Homocysteine, activated microglia, so the immune system being activated, those can all increase the phosphorylation of tau. Oops, hang on. And so, look, this is very complicated, this slide, so don't worry too much about the complication on it, but this is just really to say that this is one of the hypotheses. So we've had the amyloid hypothesis, the tau hypothesis. This is now the calcium hypothesis, and the idea of this is that Alzheimer's is due to calcium levels becoming too high within the cells, within the neurons. And calcium does enter cells through calcium channels on the cell membrane. That bit up the top is the cell membrane. That is normal. And it triggers a response within the cell. And then it's actively pumped back out of the cell or into the endoplasmic reticulum so that the cytoplasm within the cell always remains fairly low in calcium. But what happens in Alzheimer's is that mechanism doesn't work well, and calcium builds up, which eventually, through a cascade reaction, can lead to cell death. And one of the things that's important here is energy production, because the brain uses a lot of energy. About 20% of the energy in the body is used by the brain. And if the brain is unable to produce adequate energy, this system won't work well. Because obviously it takes a lot of energy to keep that calcium gradient, to keep calcium out of the cell, and pump it back across the plasma membrane. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Then we've got another hypothesis, homocysteine hypothesis. Again, this was one of the early studies. So they observed that patients with Alzheimer's had higher serum concentrations of homocysteine. So homocysteine, you remember the methylation cycle, yeah? And homocysteine is an intermediate in that cycle. It gets remethylated to methionine, and then that's sort of converted through a couple of other steps to SAM to produce the universal methyl donor SAM. And then as that's used up, it's back to homocysteine again. So homocysteine is important, but if it builds up too high, then it's been seen that there's an association with increased dementia and also cardiovascular disease. And in fact, if you do go to the GP and get homocysteine tested, a lot of them don't do the test, but those that will agree to do it, their normal range is, I think it's below 11. Yeah, yeah. And Professor Bredesen targets a lower level than that, so less than 7. And there have been mixed results on whether lowering homocysteine reduces cognitive decline. Do you know some of the ways to lower homocysteine?
Methyl donors.
Sorry?
Methyl donors.
Yeah, exactly. So B6, B12, folate. There are also some other Bs and zinc, etc., and other things. But yes, so getting that methylation cycle working properly. And this was just a study that sort of said, really concluded that the reason that there had been differences between, and that not all studies had shown B vitamins to be effective at lowering homocysteine, was really the way the trials had been done. So microglia, so these are another key area in Alzheimer's. So microglia are important in the brain. They're part of the brain's immune cells. And when we're young, they sort of look like that on the left. And as we age, they change shape, they become more amoeboid, and they become more pro-inflammatory. So they're quite happy to sort of spit out cytokines, inflammatory mediators with less provocation, shall we say. And that, as part of sort of the whole inflammatory picture of Alzheimer's, is obviously a problem. Then we've got the acetylcholine hypothesis. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter important for memory. It's synthesized from choline and acetyl-CoA. And so basically what it was found that people with Alzheimer's had lower levels of acetylcholine. So it was thought, right, okay, it's these low levels that are causing the problem. And there is a treatment that using acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, which increases levels of acetylcholine. But now it's not sure, it's sort of chicken and egg. It's thought that maybe the low levels of acetylcholine come later on in the disease process, as opposed to being the cause of the disease process. So really what we're saying here is there are lots of different things going on. It's not, as somebody said, it is not a single pathway that is affected. So all these different hypotheses, there's elements of all of them really. So Beta amyloid, so things that can cause beta amyloid to build up, as I said, oxidative stress, inflammation. Well, activated microglia can cause that oxidative stress and inflammation. When you've got a build-up of beta amyloid, that will then increase tau tangles, and vice versa. Tau tangles in the cell increase the production of beta amyloid. Calcium dysregulation I talked about. Now, calcium dysregulation works both ways. So if you've got calcium dysregulation, that will trigger beta amyloid production, but beta amyloid can puncture the cell membrane and contribute to calcium dysregulation. So a lot of these things work both ways. So on the left, you've got a healthy brain and then advanced Alzheimer's on the right. And obviously, you know, in the early stages, you wouldn't see that. You know, the brain might look healthy on an MRI. It's in the later stages that you start to see significant atrophy. And actually, to start with, the atrophy starts in the hippocampus, which is just there in the middle, which is the area of the brain that converts short-term memory to long-term memory. And drug therapy, of course, has failed. There is no effective drug for Alzheimer's. Millions has been spent, and some companies have now pulled out of research. So Pfizer, about 18 months ago, just totally stopped any research into Alzheimer's because, of course, they were spending a lot of money on it and not actually getting anywhere. The government announced, yes, that they're going to increase, but I think it was £80,000, was it?
No,
No, not 80,000.
80 million.
Was it?
It was quite high, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But,
Yeah. Hopefully, they didn't mention, obviously, whether they're going to look at preventative things, but... so currently, no therapeutics are available to stop the progression of Alzheimer's. FDA-approved Alzheimer drugs modestly alleviate symptoms temporarily. So there are things like acetylcholine inhibitors, etc. So they might work for a short time. But part of the problem is they're only really addressing one pathway. I think it was 800,000. I don't think it was, yeah, I think it was 800,000, which, so less than a million, yes, because actually I heard it on the way here and it struck me that it was less than a million, really. If millions and millions have already been spent, it's just not going to really do anything. So Professor Bredston basically describes Alzheimer's as a roof with many holes. He firstly talked about 36 holes, now more recently he's been talking about 48 holes. And you know, drugs really just plug one of the holes. So you've got to plug quite a lot of the holes. And what he actually says is that most people have 12 or more mechanisms that need addressing, so 12 or more holes. So it's a case of identifying, if you've got somebody in front of you, identifying what is relevant in that person and then addressing those factors. But the root causes of the imbalances are too much inflammation, hormone imbalance and toxicity, and lack of trophic support actually as well. So, you know, poor nutritional status, low vitamin D. And Professor Bredston has subcategorised Alzheimer's into a number of different subtypes. Now, they all have a similar pathology. So in these people, you would see beta amyloid, you would see hyperphosphorylation of tau, but there's a different etiology. So it's different sort of underlying things going on. So in the first one, subtype 1, inflammatory or infectious, here you would be able to detect biomarkers of systemic inflammation. So maybe raised CRP, for example. Or there might be prolonged infection, and obviously that could be quite a low, you know, a chronic low-level infection. And these people may be insulin resistant. And then you've got subtype 1.5, which is sort of in between the subtype 1 and the subtype 2. It's got features of both, but these people often have type 2 diabetes. And then atrophic, that's often seen in older people. So these people might not actually have raised inflammatory markers because they're beyond the state of where they can even manage to raise an inflammatory response. And they often have low trophic support, so things like vitamin D may be low, hormones may be low. You know, some hormones obviously are important as trophic factors for the brain. So significant tissue atrophy, usually low nutritional status, so beyond inflammation and a state of burnout. And then we've got subtype 3. This often occurs in younger people, so mycotoxins, which we talked about a bit earlier, may be relevant, or heavy metals. Subtype 4, vascular. So this has similarities with vascular dementia, but also differences. So you would see beta amyloid in this. But it's characterised by impaired or reduced blood flow and damage to the vascular system. And then we've got traumatic, so brain injury. And you've got two types. Obviously, you've got, somebody might have a severe single impact to the head, or often, people who are doing contact sports, they've got repetitive, mild concussions occurring over a long period of time, and there's a lot of studies now linking that to increased risk of dementia. And I do, worry about teenagers and young children, playing football, rugby, etc., and having, these mild injuries to their head. They should be wearing helmets or something, I don't know, and not headering the ball maybe. So the key features of the pathology of Alzheimer's, as I said, excess inflammation, and we all have different genetic dispositions to inflammation. So some people will be genetically predisposed to a more sort of inflammatory state. And obviously inflammation is important, it does have important functions. We do need some inflammation. The problem is when it carries on in a chronic way and doesn't switch off after it's done its sort of job, or where it's continually triggered. So things like the gut, for example, LPS being produced by dysbiotic gut flora can keep triggering inflammation. And then dysinsulinaemia, so this is a word we made up actually, really to describe both ways, too much insulin or too little. Insulin does have important functions for the brain. So obviously the too much is, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, because, people are eating lots of sugary foods, so the pancreas produces more and more insulin, which, is ignored. And then insufficient insulin production, which can occur, if somebody is in that sort of high insulin state, eventually the pancreas might struggle to produce the level of insulin required, and so insufficient insulin production, that can have a negative effect on the brain as well. And the brain can actually become insulin resistant as much as 20 years ahead of Alzheimer's symptoms, and it becomes insulin resistant before other tissues in the body as well. And there's two problems with this. One is it means that the cells are not getting the fuel that they need, and the other means that you've then got high blood sugar that is causing damage. You've got these advanced glycation end products being produced, causing damage to cellular structures. And then insufficient insulin is a trophic factor, and it's important for the formation of new synapses and neurons. So this is characteristic in particular of subtype 2 atrophic Alzheimer's. And then other hormone imbalances that may occur with Alzheimer's, low levels of thyroid hormone, and that's one of the first things the GP will check if somebody goes complaining of cognitive symptoms. They'll check out thyroid hormone. Low levels of sex hormones, so estrogen, for example, so that's why often around time of menopause, women often complain of brain fog and other symptoms. And high levels of cortisol, so stress. Persistently elevated cortisol is linked to brain shrinkage. And as well as being sort of directly damaging to brain cells, cortisol, of course, can affect so many other systems of the body, can't it? So blood sugar balance, sleep, gut health, thyroid, etc. So it's having sort of multiple effects really on the brain. And of course depression is now also being seen as an inflammatory condition. There's an interesting book by, I think he's called Professor Edward Bulmore, called The Inflamed Mind. And he's an actual medical doctor, and he is talking about how, whereas it used to be thought something like rheumatoid, if you had rheumatoid arthritis and you were depressed, the medical profession would say, well, of course you're depressed if you've got rheumatoid arthritis. And now they're seeing that actually there is a common link. They are both conditions of inflammation. And of course, you know, the hormone imbalances that can contribute to cognitive decline can also contribute to depression. So high cortisol, low thyroid, low estrogen. So Professor Bredston basically has used what's called a functional medicine approach. I know some of you are familiar. You're familiar with what functional medicine is? It's basically looking at root causes, so doing a lot of testing, blood testing, urine tests, stool tests. He also looks at people's genetics and also MRI scans, etc. And then addressing the whole person, so using a holistic approach just like we do, diet and lifestyle. So the interventions he's looking at are firstly diet, at the minimum a low glycemic diet, gluten-free. In some cases he's using ketogenic as well. In quite a lot of cases actually. For people with a diagnosis, I mean it's slightly different if people are looking for preventative, but for people with a diagnosis using ketogenic. You're familiar with ketogenic diet? High fat. Supplements, he uses a lot of supplements, and we've developed actually a brain health range which of supplements that we collaborated with him on the development of that range. He looks at gut health, exercise, physical activity, sleep, reducing stress, brain stimulation, so using maybe computer programs and other things to stimulate the brain, you know, along the idea that use it or lose it type idea. Hormone health and correcting that, removing heavy metals and molds, and also social connection. So I'm going to go through each of those sort of fairly briefly. So in terms of nutrition, of course, well, you know, nutrition, well, I would say that as a nutritional therapist is at the heart of health. And we need about 55 nutrients, micronutrients, plus amino acids, essential fatty acids. But many people are short of key nutrients for many different reasons, and we refer to that as the nutrition gap. So that's the difference between what you get from your diet and what you need for optimal health. And across the board, really, there is a gap in that. And so the diet sort of things that he's looking at, as I said, it's a low GI diet, so low in carbohydrates, maybe ketogenic. Omega-3 fatty acids, of course, are very important. The brain is 60% fat. DHA in particular is an important structural component of the brain. Vitamin A, there's been some research on low levels of vitamin A being associated with increased beta amyloid. And of course, vitamin A really important for the integrity of the gut. And if you've got poor gut integrity or leaky gut, likelihood is you'd have leaky brain as well. B vitamins, of course, they're needed for the brain for energy production, also for methylation. And methylation is important for two reasons. One would be, of course, keeping homocysteine within good levels. And the other is for creating neurotransmitters, breaking down neurotransmitters. Vitamin D is anti-inflammatory. It's important for the immune system. It's also important for synaptic maintenance. Magnesium is involved in energy production in the brain and also important for synaptic plasticity. Zinc has antioxidant effects. It's also needed for protein synthesis. And then antioxidants as well, wider range of antioxidants. And antioxidants are particularly important for the brain because the brain is made up of 60% fat, and fat is particularly susceptible to free radical damage. And the other thing is, of course, because the brain is producing so much energy, what you get alongside that is increased free radical production. So antioxidants are needed to mop up the free radicals. And as I said, we don't necessarily get enough of all these nutrients from our diet. Even we've done some analysis, people eating a cleaned up diet. So we always want to clean up people's diet and improve their diet by, lots of vegetables, fruits, maybe some nuts, seeds, some good sources of protein, etc. So meat, fish, eggs, beans and pulses. But even if you clean up somebody's diet, it's quite difficult to get all the nutrients needed. And that's because of the way food is grown. Intensive farming means the levels in the food are lower. Lifestyle factors increase people's nutrients needs. So there's a good website actually, if you've got clients that are taking medication, you can check nutrient depletions if you go on www.monotherapy.com mytavin, mytavin.com. You can type in a list of medications and it will come up with a list of potential nutrient depletions. Yeah, yeah. mytavin.com. So it's very, very quick to use. You know, you can put in 5 medications and it will come up with potential nutrient depletions and the references, which is quite nice. So yes, so there's obviously medications, obviously genetics can change what nutritional requirements we have. What else? Food processing has affected obviously nutrient content as well. Things like smoking, sun exposure will increase the requirement for nutrients. So yes, there's quite a gap between what we get from even an optimal diet and what we need, which is why we would always say it's a good idea to take a multi. And I don't know if you've read any of Professor Bruce Ames' work. So his paper, 2006, he wrote a paper on sort of his triage theory. And what he says, and it makes perfect sense, is if you've got a micronutrient and there isn't enough of it, the body will use it for those processes that are critical for survival at the expense of nice-to-do processes. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? If you take zinc, zinc is needed for 300 different processes. If you haven't got enough zinc, your body is going to use it for those processes that will keep you alive and forget all the repair and the recovery and the housekeeping. So yes, he wrote that paper in 2006, and then he wrote another paper actually just about a year ago, age 96 I think he was.
What was his name, sorry?
Bruce Ames, A-M-E-S, Professor Bruce Ames. Triage Theory of Aging, I think it's called. So he recommends as well that everyone takes a multi. So back to diet then. So Professor Bredesen recommends ketogenic diet. If you are going to recommend this at all to your clients, it's worth doing some extra training in it. There's a lot to it. There is the American Nutrition Association do a course. It's about 500 quid, which I'm doing at the moment actually. It's about 100 hours of online training on ketogenic diets. But the reason Professor Bredesen recommends this is because brain glucose uptake is impaired in Alzheimer's, and ketones from fats provide an alternative source of fuel and very effective. And so increasing ketones improves cognition in both MCI and Alzheimer's. Problem with it is compliance. It's not easy. 75% fat. You can still eat a lot of veg on it actually, as long as it's sort of more the green leafy veg, obviously nothing starchy. You can, I did it for a while and still managed to eat sort of 7 portions of veg. The other problem is transition. People get side effects. Firstly, maybe constipation, then diarrhea, what's called keto flu apathy. There are ways to sort of prevent those from happening. That's why really, it's important to have a good understanding of it. And really, if somebody is doing it long term, they need to monitor. So, do some initial blood tests and then monitoring after sort of 6 months or so. And there's also a question mark over whether it's suitable for everybody. It's not necessarily suitable for everybody. But it is getting good results because it's very anti-inflammatory, basically, and it switches on natural antioxidant systems in the body, as well as I said, providing the brain with an alternative source of fuel. So actually what he uses as well is what he's calling Ketoflex, which is mild ketosis, and also using fasting to achieve ketosis and using MCT oil or even exogenous ketones, which are very, very expensive. MCT oil is cheaper, but exogenous ketones are very expensive.
What's MCT?
MCT is medium chain triglycerides, so it's sort of taken out from, it's coconut oil, but extracts of specific triglycerides from coconut oil. Now, obviously, so for somebody with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, may want to go down the ketogenic route. For most people, maybe with brain fog or other brain issues, changing their diet to a Mediterranean-style diet, or what I call a low-carb Mediterranean diet, so maybe having a gluten elimination, because as I'm going to talk about, gluten can have some negative effects on the brain, plus lots of veg, etc. That might be enough. I'm not going to talk about that. So So just to talk a little bit about the gut-brain communication. So obviously communication between the gut and the brain is sort of bidirectional, and the gut health is a key part of Professor Bredson's approach. And there's been research into using probiotics and showing that they're beneficial for things such as memory loss, depression and anxiety, and some of the mechanisms by which that effects are seen are understood. So for example, the gut bacteria produce certain brain chemicals. Also, dysbiotic bacteria, as I said, can be quite pro-inflammatory. So they produce this LPS, this lipopolysaccharide, which can contribute to leaky gut and also leaky brain. So the factors affecting the gut-brain axis: the composition of the gut microbiome, so the bacteria and other microbes in the gut can affect it, leaky gut and hypersensitivity to food allergens. And all these factors, of course, can be affected by gluten, which is obviously one of the themes of today. Actually, sorry, due to time, I'm not going to talk about these. You can have a look in. This is really just to sort of make the links between what's going on in the gut. The gut has a significant effect on our endocrine system as well, and the composition of bacteria in the gut. And of course, as I already talked about, blood sugar imbalances, thyroid hormone are also important for the brain. So if you've got people with thyroid hormone issues or blood sugar imbalances, you also want to be thinking about what's going on in their gut. I will just mention this because this is a nice, an interesting case study of that illustrates the links between the gut and the brain. And this was a town in Canada, Walkerton, Ontario, and in 2000 the water became contaminated with E. coli and Campylobacter, and more than 2,000 people became seriously ill and some people died. And afterwards, hundreds of people developed post-infectious IBS. And what happened, obviously, is they had sort of inflammation from the pathogens, created inflammation, which remained chronic, because when you have a pathogen, maybe you get rid of the pathogen, but it can create a long-term dysbiosis in the gut that then can lead to chronic inflammation. So that's what happened in this case. And they followed these people for about 8 years, and they remained sort of ill throughout that time, even though the initial pathogen had disappeared, but it had triggered this long-term change. So 3 to 6 months after the initial infection, 1 in 5 of the people had come down with post-infectious IBS and depression. And as I said, they followed them for about 8 years, didn't actually intervene or help them out. But eventually they did help them out, fortunately. But also they did some fecal transplants, which was interesting, into mice. So they took some of the samples from the people that were ill and put them into the mice. What do you think happened to the mice? Yeah, eventually probably, but initially, yeah, they got IBS and became depressed. And fecal transplants is an interesting area of research. They're doing lots of it with mice, looking at composition of the gut microbiota and the effects on things like obesity. So, if you take a fecal transplant from an obese human and transplant that into the mouse becomes fat, etc.
May we ask where they transplanted
to the gut. Yeah, to the gut. And there's also interest in fecal transplants for helping people with IBS. There's a clinic in Hertfordshire, actually, where people can go. It's a 2-week programme, and so you have to sort of stay there, basically. Well, not in the clinic. You have to stay locally for 2 weeks, and every day, or I think 5 days a week, for 2 weeks, you will have a fecal transplant. It's quite expensive, but it's being used for IBS. And there was a case in the paper a couple of years ago of somebody who'd done a fecal transplant at home. She was very ill, and she'd read about fecal transplants, and she went to her doctor and said, could you do this? I can't remember what the pathogen was that she had, but anyway, it was just totally resistant to antibiotics. She said to the doctor, I've read about fecal transplants, is this something you'd be able to help me with? And they said, well, no, not really, but we could, if you find a donor, we'd be happy to test the donor. So her partner very healthy in that department. So he was the donor. They checked his stool, which was sort of clean of any nasties. She then did it at home, and they had a picture in the newspaper of the liquidizer where she'd sort of... and she had, God, it'll come to me in a minute what it was she had, but anyway, within...
It's usually C difficile.
It might have been, yeah. And she was very, very, very ill. And within 24 hours, she was significantly better. So obviously it wasn't, it was used, by enema, not sort of taken that way. But they are, in America, they're doing it both ways, by enema in some places and also trapules. So crapule would be that route. So back to gluten then. So gluten, this is interesting, this paper concluded that gluten sensitivity destroys brain tissue more than any other tissue in the body, including the gastrointestinal tract. So the most common area of non-intestinal manifestation of gluten sensitivity is in the brain. And I think on this slide, yes, number of mechanisms by which gluten affects the brain. Actually, I haven't got them all on here, but one is it increases the expression of zonulin. So zonulin is an enzyme that occurs in the gut and that is involved in leaky gut. But that also occurs in the brain, zonulin, and gluten increases the expression of it, contributing to leaky brain. Also, anti-gliadin antibodies can react with brain proteins. So there's one called synapsin in particular, which again is important for the blood-brain barrier. Autoimmunity, so transglutaminase 6, so that's another one of these proteins. It's also found in the gut. Transglutaminase 2 is the one in the gut, a similar one in the brain. And alteration of gut microbiota. So it's been shown that just eating gluten changes the gut microbiota to a more pro-inflammatory type of gut microbiota. There are other ways, of course, it can also affect the brain that I haven't got on here. If it's contributing to malabsorption in the gut, then there may be, low levels of certain nutrients that are important for brain function. And Rosemary mentioned, gluteomorphins, so sort of opioid-like substances as well, which of course can affect the brain. And, part of the problem is the amount that people are eating. If we just ate gluten every few days, in a meal, and it was something that had been really well fermented, they used to ferment things maybe for a few days, as opposed to the Chorleywood method, which ferments things for 10 minutes. And fermentation, of course, partly helps break it down. So if we were just eating it occasionally, and not at every meal, I mean, that's some people's diet is like that, isn't it? So every meal and snacks in between, because what happens when you eat gluten, when anybody eats gluten, it triggers leaky gut. That happens in everybody, because it increases expression of zonulin. Now, some people will just repair that damage. So, if you haven't got it, if you haven't developed gluten sensitivity, you'll get a leaky gut after eating it and then repair it. And the work that has been done on that has been done by an Italian researcher called Alessio Fasano, if you want to look up his work. He explained how gluten increases zonulin expression, so increases the leaky gut. But as I said, it doesn't mean that everybody shouldn't eat it, because some people, will repair that. Where it might be a problem is, if you're eating it every meal and you've got other things going on, maybe, you've got a lot of stress, or the rest of your diet is pretty rubbish, etc. And that's where leaky gut can become more of a permanent feature. And of course, that's being seen as a significant root cause of many diseases. Sorry, did you have a...
Oh, just say that name again.
Alessio Fasano, Fasano. So obviously, apart from the fact that this diet has gluten at every meal, it's obviously lacks in a number of other areas as well. Now, the problem is people then go gluten-free, as Rosemary was talking about earlier, they switch to these gluten-free products. Well, when you think that if you make a loaf of bread, normal bread has 4 ingredients, if you're making it at home, it's got 4 ingredients, hasn't it? Flour, water, yeast and salt. This is just full of all sorts of rubbish. And the other problem, of course, is that wheat supplies most of the fibre in our diet. And when people take that out, they then virtually, because they don't increase the veg, etc., they've really lost all their fibre. So it results in a very low fibre diet. Now there was a paper a couple of years ago that came out that said eating gluten-free is unhealthy, it's bad for your health. And what they had done is they had compared 1,700 gluten-free products. I mean, can you believe that there are 1,700 gluten-free products with 1,700 equivalents? And I wrote a blog on this paper, actually, so the details in my blog. And they concluded that switching to gluten-free basically resulted in less protein, less fibre, more sugar, and more unhealthy fat. And so I read that paper, and I then sort of decided, okay, I'm going to do a comparison of a wheat-based diet and a gluten-free product diet. So this is my comparison. So I compared, if you had somebody that maybe had breakfast cereal, followed by a sandwich, followed by pasta, and if you compare the wheat-based and the gluten-free, if you then look at a nutritional analysis of that, yeah, what they were saying in that paper was correct. So if you look at the total sugar, it's only increased slightly in the gluten-free products, but the fibre, look how much that's gone down. And the proteins decrease as well. And of course the problem with both of those diets that I showed you is they're very limited in the number of foods. They're just neither of them are good diets, are they? Let's face it. And so that was the diets that I compared, basically. And of course this is how people can eat gluten-free. There is no reason for people to eat any of that gluten-free rubbish. I mean, you know, if people want to, if they don't have a problem with all grains, you know, some people that have a problem with wheat actually have a problem with all grains. But if they don't have a problem with all grains and they want to occasionally eat some of these gluten-free foods, maybe keep some bread in the freezer for occasional use, fine. But not swapping it at every meal. Does that make sense? And the other thing about this example diet that I've put up there is I think it's about 22 different foods in a day. So it's much more diverse, which is what we want to encourage people to do, is to increase the diversity of their diet. There's a great, it's not on this blog, but on another blog that we wrote, there's a nice table that you can use with clients that's called the 50 Food Challenge. And over a week, you get people to try and eat 50 different types of food. So if they're eating bread and pasta, that's one food. So they can write it on this table once. If they're eating red onions and white onions, that's two foods because you've got different phytonutrients in those. So if anybody wants that, I mean, I could send it to you actually. It's so later. So that was included in a paper by Miguel Toribio, if you've been to any of our seminars, Mateus. Yeah, who's the chairman of BANT, the British Association of Nutrition and Nutritional Therapy. The other thing that Professor Bredston considers, I've only got 5 minutes, is fasting. So this isn't fasting forever, this is just, you know, not constantly snacking. And there's a number of benefits, including overnight. That is when beta amyloid is broken down during an overnight fast. So, you know, if you go to bed having just eaten, your body will actually will be breaking down insulin, because the same enzyme that breaks down insulin, it's called IDE, also breaks down beta amyloid. So that's one of the reasons, but there are other benefits as well. And it also, fasting increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like a miracle grow for the brain. Stress reduction, talked about this already. High levels of cortisol, bad for brain cells, cause atrophy of the brain, and there's a number of different other mechanisms by which stress is negative for the brain as well. Sleep, 8 hours every night. There's a great book by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep. Yes, some people have read it. And he talks about having an 8-hour sleep opportunity. And of course, a lot of people skimp on sleep because there's so many other more interesting things to do, like watching Netflix or, you know, being on the phone. So he talks about being very disciplined and making sure you get an 8-hour sleep opportunity. So if you've got to be up at 7 in the morning, what time do you need to be having your light off? 11, yeah. Now you might not sleep all of those 8 hours, but you will still get some benefit from resting, and your body, you know, you might sort of get, if you're out of the habit of sleeping for a long period of time, you can change your sort of sleep habits. And sleeping, it works by a number of mechanisms. One of the things I said earlier was that the lymphatic system is most active at night. So that's the brain's clearance system. And also sleep promotes this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which, as I said, is like miracle growth of the brain. Melatonin itself, which is the sleep hormone, has a number of beneficial effects for the brain. It has antioxidant effects and others. Exercise is the other thing he looks at. Again, that increases this BDNF, and it reduces the risk of dementia and depression by about 30% by a number of different mechanisms. And brain training, so this is doing things like, crosswords, Sudoku, table tennis, and there are online apps as well, things like Lumosity, and there are some for free or apps that you can pay a monthly subscription to. So a number of these different things that I've been talking about increase this BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and conversely, it's decreased by a high sugar, high fat diet. When I say high fat, I mean the undesirable fats, social isolation as well. And as well as BDNF supporting cognition, it also has antidepressant effects. So the areas that he considers then, as I said, diet, supplements, gut health, sleep, physical activity, reducing stress, brain training, toxicity I haven't really talked about, and also social interaction, really important. And he started off initially, he had 10 patients in a paper that was published in 2014, and 9 of them got better. Then he had a later paper in 2018 where he reported on 100 patients. And what was good about that paper was that they had been treated by different physicians, so they weren't all his patients. Now in that paper, he no longer mentions the 90% reversal. So it wasn't that 90% of them reversed their symptoms. He doesn't actually mention a percentage, but the paper's interesting because he lists every patient and lists what their starting position was, as per the tests that were carried out, and what their finished position was. And there was also a study that we, or AIM Foundation funded, Lancaster University, carried out a review and looked at a number of different multimodal studies and their effects, and basically they concluded that multimodal non-pharmacological interventions have the potential to complement standard therapy and by addressing multiple modifiable risk factors. And there's a few others that have done. This one was a preventative study again, so it looked at using a number of different, because of course there are lots and lots of studies looking just at sleep or just at exercise or just at stress. There are fewer studies that have looked at all these things together, and obviously they have synergistic effects. It's not even just additive, it's synergistic. So this was one that looked at prevention, and there's also a clinic in the US called the Alzheimer Prevention Clinic. Again, that's using several different modes and having good results. And there was a book by some other neurologists in California called the Neuroplan. They use a similar approach to Professor Bredston. They don't seem to have spoken to each other, the Cherzais and they, I think, are working with people at an earlier stage than Professor Bredston has been working with. And their approach doesn't use quite all the modes that he does. So they're using, nutrition, exercise, stress, and sleep. Then there was the finger study in Finland, the mind study in Chicago. So there have been a few of these things, really. And really the message as well is that as well as optimizing cognitive function, this kind of approach is going to have a benefit to, I could have entitled this talk 6 Steps to Health, or 6 Steps to Thyroid Health, or 6 Steps, So it is a program really to support optimal health. And very, very quickly, finally, just wanted to mention we've got a few new products. So I've got some if you want to pick up some information on the stand. There's a leaflet on our Cytoprotect range. So this formula is a multi-nutrient and herb formula designed for gut health. So as part of gut repair and gut healing programs. We've got as well a botanical formula for the liver. And I haven't brought any today, but doggy range. So we've got a multi probiotic. I love that. Joint support to Doggy Your Greens and Doggy Omega. And we've got a couple of other products coming out next year as well. And finally, what's that? Yeah, cats are really tricky, actually. Yeah, so we haven't got to cats yet. But the one thing I do want to mention just here is our one-to-one training. If you would like to do an hour's product training, we use Zoom. You don't need to have Zoom yourself. We just send you a link. You click on the link, and we can do live 1 hour one-to-one training with you. When you book on the link, and I will send maybe the link to you, when you book on the link, you can put what areas you're particularly interested in. We have a standard sort of 80-slide presentation, but we can focus on those areas that are particularly of interest to you. So, and the other thing is, if you have any questions, if you've got a particular client and you want to know, where do you think I should start in terms of testing, which product should I use, very happy if you give us a bit of background on the client and we'll recommend some products to test as priority. Thank you.